Hello friends, I am Chevee. Welcome to my shed. How are you today? How's life in your world? How's things where you are? I hope it's all good and great and wonderful. I have finished book one of The Wheel of Time, The Eye of the World. I started reading it last week. It's done, and I'm ready to move on to book two, which I'm hoping to do before the show starts. But, with the speed that I read this, I could probably read through book four before the show starts, but I don't want to commit that much time to reading because, as I mentioned yesterday, I did basically nothing but read this weekend. So I don't know how long it took me to read the book, but I read it over the span of 5 days. That being said, I've also read this book probably about 5 times now. I believe this was my fifth reading. I'm not really sure. I first purchased this in the mid-90s. This is a first printing copy that I purchased as a teen in the mid-90s. And I read it then, and then I read it later, and then I've read it again since then, and I've tried to read this series a few times. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, I met a friend who was also a big fan of The Wheel of Time, and we co-read of the books through for a while and played the video game that came out then and enjoyed ourselves. But I picked this up this time to read it, and I was just, the cover's falling off. It wasn't really the right feel. So I went ahead and bought it on the Kindle, and I ended up doing this reading on the Kindle. And I'm glad I did, because this is a first printing, or not a first printing, but a first edition, I guess. And this doesn't contain the Gwain prologue that's in the second edition, which came out in the early 2000s. So I've never read that Gwain prologue until I got it on the Kindle, and that was cool. It was a neat little prologue. I guess it was added as a way to YA-ify the book, meaning that they wanted to show the kids as younglings, and it was told through Nynaeve's perspective, and it was a fun little story. It was a neat little story. So here's the thing. I honestly, the last time I tried to read The Wheel of Time, I think I made it to book 8. I'm not positive. Looking at the spines of my books, the first 5 are all pretty worn. I've read the first 5 at least 3 or 4 times now, but it looks like I made it all the way at least to book 8 in paperback, and I have a bunch of them in hardback. I would love to someday go back and collect the hardbacks, but I don't think I have the first 3 or 4 in the original printing, and they're really expensive right now because of the show. And if you're not aware, I'm reading this right now because the show comes out next month, and I want to refresh. It's been a long time since I've visited this world. And I really enjoyed this revisit. I'm much older now than the last time I read this. It's probably been about 15 years, maybe 13 to 15, 12 to somewhere around there. My child was young when I last read it, and she's 17 now. And the reading this time was a little bit more critical because I have tried to get back into writing, and so I have writing on the brain. So a lot of what happens in this book I was kind of critical of. There's a whole lot of exposition. There's a whole lot of characters just vomiting at the mouth. But at the same time, Robert Jordan covers a whole lot of ground in this book. He sets up a whole world of people that, if you continue to read through the series, he explores in depth. Nations and customs and people are very, very different. And some of the things that amused me about it were there are differences in people that live just 20 miles apart. Like, the characters go on these, they stop in all of these towns along their journey in this book as they're running from the big bad. And they remark at how different everybody is. But they're like a day or two away, which is on foot 20 or 40 miles. This isn't, the land that is this book isn't huge. It's not United States big. It's Europe sized, right? So these cultures exist, and they're only like 100 miles apart or something, maybe 1,000 miles at most, which is, to a U.S. person's perspective, not very far, right? It's not that far away. But in the world of these people who are living these very culturally centered lives that don't venture outside of their culture, it could just be, the next clearing in the woods is a completely different culture. I found that to be pretty fun this time, and it kind of made me laugh. Like, I didn't recognize it before, but I recognize it now, just how small the world is. How it doesn't take them that long to go from where they are in the beginning to where they're trying to get to the final leap. It's not that far. It's a few hundred miles or something like that. Anyway, I'm also aware of a lot of the criticisms leveled against this book. Some people criticize the women in this book because Robert Jordan tried to create a world where women have not necessarily ultimate power, but women are. It's not necessarily a patriarchal society. It's more of a matriarchal society, but there's also the men's council and the women's council, and the women have a whole lot of agency. And that feels great. But a lot of people criticize the way the women act in this book because they act like little girls. They're these powerful women, but they're always stomping their feet and tugging their hair and storming off and whatever. But I think that the thing to remember, while that's true, they do act juvenile. It's also, this book is told through the eyes of a 20-ish, or an 18-year-old man. Like, the narrator might not necessarily be a trustworthy narrator of women, right? Like, we have to remember that Rand doesn't have a lot of experience with women, and so he sees these behaviors and takes them, we're seeing those behaviors through the context of him. And he takes it as they're being these, they're being bratty or something like that. I've also, thought a long time about the criticisms of this being a Lord of the Rings ripoff. And Robert Jordan specifically said this is a Lord of the Rings ripoff. Like, this was his homage to the Lord of the Rings. And I think there is room to say that because J.R. Tolkien tried to create a mythology for Britain, and that's what the Lord of the Rings was, and because of the setting of this book, maybe it's not necessarily wrong to say that this is the Lord of the Rings. Maybe it's a continuation of the same story, which is what the Wheel of Time is, right? It's the repeating of this story. The story has repeated thousands of times, and maybe this is that version. Maybe this is Robert Jordan's version of that same story. Don't know, but it's a fun read. Diving back into it felt like a familiar blanket. Reading through this, it felt very familiar, and at the same time, I surprised myself by reading it very intensely. Often when I reread a book or when I read a book that is comfortable, I skim a lot, or I'll just summarize paragraphs and move on, because there is a good deal of like I said earlier, there's a good deal of exposition in here, and if you know, then you don't really need to read it. And it's kind of one of the criticisms I always had when trying to read Robert Jordan, read The Wheel of Time in particular, is every book summarizes everything that's happened before it. The book opens with this summary that's so freaking frustrating to get through. And later in the series, it becomes this slog that just, I remember all that stuff. And the characters have to just constantly repeat at you things you already know, and it gets really annoying. And that's part of the reason why I never made it through the series, because I found that to be annoying. But this time, reading it, I knew all of the things in here. I've read this 5 times. I know what happens in this book. But I read it very intently, and I stayed with it, and I really enjoyed that way of reading it. I really enjoyed studying it and seeing it for what it is, which is a setup. It's a setup. This is the setup for the rest of the series. And because of that, I accepted the exposition. I accepted the characters just vomiting everything at you and telling you, having these grandiose moments where they just decide to, dump some information on you. I accepted it. I don't know that I could accept it had I... It's not the way that modern authors write, right? Modern authors are much more showy than telly, is the words that authors like to use, show don't tell, where they mean that, give the character, give the setting through action, through words, through events. Don't give it through characters just But I accepted it in this, and I think that part of that exception came from my familiarity with the rest of the series. So I enjoyed this a lot. I enjoyed reading it. I mean, obviously, I read it in 5 days, and or 6 days. I think that I'm determined to finish the series this time, and I feel like after I finished reading this, I have a better understanding of what that's going to entail, and I've accepted it, right? I've accepted that I'm going to have to deal with that annoying opening. But this book on its own is pretty awesome just as a book. Like, you could read just this and that's it, and understand that what's about to happen when this closes is a hero's journey tale. It's this character going on this adventure to save the thing, right? And in this case, the thing is the everything, right? Trying to save all of time and material. You just have to be willing to accept that Robert's going to give you a lot of information in not a lot of pages, 800 pages. You're going to get a info dump every now and then, and it's going to feel weird and awkward. There's going to be some moments where characters are going to do things and say things that don't really make a lot of sense. For instance, I'll give you an example. I forgot how weird the meeting with the Queen is in this book, and I don't want to spoil that for you. But there is a meeting of the Queen and her guard and her children, and it's really awkward because there's foreigners in a room, and the Queen acts like she has to chide her children, and it's just this. I get it because he wanted to introduce those characters to you and move on. Like the book isn't about them, but they become important later. So let's take a couple of pages, and the characters will do some really uncourtly behavioral things just to get that out of the way, and then let's move. And the book does that quite a few times. There's quite a few instances where we need to know something for later, and instead of stalling and spending a whole bunch of time on it, Robert Jordan kind of goes against convention and just shows you some things that doesn't make the character motivation doesn't make a lot of sense. The setting doesn't make a lot of sense, and we just move on with it. And I accepted it. I accepted it wholeheartedly. The funny thing is, reading it in the past, past me, I don't think recognized any of that. Past me read it and enjoyed it for what it was, and didn't recognize the insertion of these events. I didn't recognize that what we were trying to accomplish in those pages, what Robert was trying to accomplish in those pages, was to set something up and then get out of the way, right? Like, okay, we did that. Let's go. And he does that quite a few times. And there will be a bit of, if you've never read the series, if you just want to try the book, there does seem to be, for your first time reading it, some sort of soft magic, like saves the world type thing. I often hear complaints that things seem to be set up just to save the characters. That's going to happen, and if you pay attention to what Moiraine says in this book, she's the kind of the guidepost through this whole book. That's kind of the point, right? There are going to be things that just randomly save our characters, and that's the Wheel of Time. Like, that's what it is, right? Like, you just kind of have to go, okay, and accept it for what it is, and it'll be explained out later in the series. So, Eye of the World, my fifth rereading after a very, very, very long break. I loved it. I had a blast reading it, and I really missed these characters. I always felt really close to all of them, and I'm ready to continue reading book 2. So I will let you know when that happens. If you have any specific questions, or if you want to talk about the book and your favorite parts and my favorite parts, we can do that in the comment section, or you can find me on any of the social media links that are in the description. Thank you for being here as always. Thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, being amazing friends and wonderful people. I really appreciate you, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Today's word you should know to sound smart is implausible. It is an adjective meaning difficult to believe, highly unlikely to be true. At first glance, most famous fairy tales seem so implausible and irrelevant to contemporary life that their survival is hard to understand. Alison Laurie, an American novelist and academic. Implausible. Implausible. I love that word. I like to use that word a lot in my everyday life. I don't know where I came across it first, but it seems to have always stuck with me. Is that implausible?